and welcome to Short Circuit, your podcast on the federal courts of appeals. I'm your host, Anthony Sanders, director of the Center for Judicial Engagement at the Institute for Justice. We're recording this on Thursday, January 26, 2023. We have a couple interesting cases coming up for you with a couple great guests, including a first-timer. So I'm very interested and excited to introduce him. But first, a special announcement to our Short Circuit listeners out there. We have an event in the D.C. area coming up on March 31st. It's Friday, March 31st. So if you live in the D.C. area, you can come and join us and say hi to our Short Circuit staff, pronounce our name correctly, and learn all about the case Meyer versus Nebraska, which was handed down in 1923. So it is the 100th anniversary of this monumental case for civil rights and constitutional liberties. Some of you may know Meyer versus Nebraska was a challenge to language laws that were enacted right after World War I that banned the teaching of foreign language in elementary schools. And they went all the way to the Supreme Court. The lead case was from the little town of Hampton, Nebraska, where Robert Meyer was fined for speaking German to his elementary school students. So we have a full day. It is all about this case and its ramifications, because so much led from Meyer in the 20th century, whether you're talking about the First Amendment, incorporation, parental rights, you name it, unenumerated rights generally, you name it, it's there largely because of Meyer versus Nebraska. So we have a slew of scholars who will be talking about these cases. There'll be a lot of people from IJ there. So if you'd like to learn or just mingle a little bit and you're in the DC area, please come. And for most of the listeners who are not in the DC area, we are going to be streaming it online and recording it. So details of that will be forthcoming. But if you would like to RSVP, we're going to put a link in the show notes to it. We would love to see you. We're exceedingly excited that our keynote speaker is going to be Professor William Ross of Samford University. And he literally, and I do mean literally, wrote the book on Meyer. His book from that he published in the 90s, Forging New Freedoms, Nativism, Education, and the Constitution. He went deep into the archives in a few different places in the Midwest that where these laws were passed and where they were prosecuted, and learned a lot about the case that he put into this book, and he'll be summarizing that at the keynote. And then we have all kinds of scholars who will be speaking. I don't want to name them all right now, and I don't want to only name a few because then I'd be leaving some out. So just go look at them on our webpage, and we would love to see you on March 31st. And it's at a location that's only a block from the Supreme Court, the place where, it all happens. So if you work at the court, you could take a couple hours, come down and see us. If you work near the court, you definitely could do the same thing, and we would love to see you. But couple people that I am seeing today and that you are listening to are a couple of my IJ colleagues. They are first-timer on Short Circuit, Suranjan Sen. Suranjan, welcome to Short Circuit.
Thank you very much, Anthony. It's my pleasure to be here, my honor to be here. I've been keeping up with Short Circuit for a while, and I'm real glad to be joining you today. Okay,
and Suranjan, we'll get to it a little bit, but first, a man I have known for all too long. It was a co-clerk of mine back in the summer, a glorious summer of 2003. Speaking of anniversaries, our 20th anniversary is, sorry to depress you, Rob, is Rob Fromer. So Rob, welcome back to Short Circuit. For those of you, by the way, who are interested in clerking at IJ, I think it's just about our deadline. Still a chance if you want to try to clerk here for the summer. You can apply, and we'll put a link in the show notes. But Rob, he's going to take his clerkship training and a few other things and then apply it to telling us about, I believe, how the police find bags of dope.
Bag of dope.
Yeah, so that's what we're most interested in today.
I know you're interested in bags of dope, and I'll try to satisfy you here. So this case that we're going to talk about today is called United States versus Aaron Loynes. And it's really a case about the cops trying to take shortcuts with the Fourth Amendment. But it's also about the importance of courts that take their job seriously. So all this begins in charming Euclid, Ohio. And it turns out that the Cleveland police are investigating some potential drug trafficking. I think it's like heroin and fentanyl, not nice stuff. And so they're casing this house. They're watching this house. And as they watch this house, they see this red Altima, this red Nissan Altima. It leaves the house. It goes and sells drugs to a police informant, and it comes back. So it's pretty clear that this vehicle is tied in with the drug dealing. Now, this is going on for a while, and eventually the police decide to get a search warrant, and they do get a search warrant. They get a search warrant for the house, not the car. And that's important, as you'll see. So now the police have this warrant for the house, and they're executing the warrant. And, they're looking around trying to find evidence of drug dealing and whatnot. And then all of a sudden, one of the officers, sees out on the street the red Altima. Okay. Well, the investigating officer goes up to the car, tries to peer in. It turns out that the Altima had pretty significant window tinting that made it difficult to see in. And so, but he peers in and he says, from his vantage point, I saw a small plastic bag that I immediately knew was a bag of dope near the center console. You're going to be hearing that phrase a lot, bag of dope. So the officer goes inside and asks, well, whose car is this? And our defendant, Aaron Loynes, wisely or unwisely, says, it's mine. And they confirm it by using his keys to turn on the alarm. So based on seeing this, quote, bag of dope in what they call plain view, like they immediately looked in and knew it was a bag of dope and knew that was illegal drugs, the police decide to tow the vehicle for an inventory search. Again, the warrant was for the house, not the car. They decided to tow the vehicle and search it without a warrant at all under what's known as an inventory search. And when they toss the car, guess what? Surprise, surprise, they find drugs and a gun. Now, Loynes gets arrested for both. And when he was at the district court, he moved to suppress the evidence, saying the police, they couldn't see anything. They couldn't seize my car and search it based on this. And so that was unconstitutional. You should suppress the evidence. District court rejects the motion, says, they could totally see this in plain view. And it was fine for them to seize the car based on that and search it. And so as a result, Loynes conditionally pleads guilty to 93 months in prison. Almost 8 years. Ooh. But things turn out quite different on appeal for Aaron. There, the Sixth Circuit starts to really closely examine the evidence, supporting the idea that the officer could see the bag of dope in plain view. And now the police put some things forward as evidence to suggest this. The big one they did is a picture from inside the car during the inventory search where they said, see, you can see the dope. To which the court rightly pointed out, wait a second. That's a picture from inside the car. That doesn't tell us anything about what the cop saw outside the car when he was just looking in. And so they said, okay, no. All right, we also have footage from their body cameras that shows what they were doing on the outside of the car. And the court looks at that as well, and it says, well, all that shows is what they were doing. It doesn't show the bag of dope, nor does it say that this bag of dope that this was immediately apparent to be an illegal bag of dope. So the Sixth Circuit was having none of it. It said, because the plain view and inventory exceptions to the warrant are exceptions, the government has to prove that they apply, and that the evidence that you brought to us here is just not up to the task. It just doesn't show that that you saw this bag of dope in plain view. And because of that, the seizure of the car was bad. The search of the car was bad. all the evidence they found inside the car was bad. And as a result, the Sixth Circuit ended up reversing and saying the search was unreasonable, and all the evidence against Loynes got tossed out.
Suranjan, do you know what a bag of dope looks like?
I would probably have some guesses, but I have seen episodes of The Wire, but I'm not sure that I would be willing to look through a tinted window at a car and be able to immediately know, like, oh yes, that's a bag of dope for probable cause purposes. I'm going to be willing to say no.
Rob, what was it? There was like a playing card too, or a couple very small little indicia of that often go with drug dealing, but that didn't seem to be enough for the court either.
Oh yeah, they said they saw the bag of dope in the center console, and I think they said, oh well, there was like a lottery ticket there.
Oh, that's right.
Next to it. And I think the court at that point says, like, well, what does that have to do with anything? Like, what does the fact that there's a lottery ticket have to do with anything? And they said, look, this was supposed to be in the center console. It was fairly well obscured. The windows were tinted. And you've brought nothing to the table to show us that, no, despite all that, you somehow could magically see this stuff.
What I find really interesting about this case is that probably 95% of the time, the same kind of thing happens, and the police, there will be no problem with what the police did because of, various things, such as they had a little bit more probable cause, or more usually with a vehicle search, right? The vehicle, it's because the vehicle was pulled over, and there was the driver's there so they can get in the car because it's part of a traffic stop, and therefore they find probable cause, and that leads to the arrest, and that leads to the towing of the car and the inventory search, which is this kind of like get out of the Fourth Amendment free card thing that the police often can do, because you can't just leave a car by the side of the highway. But the problem is that the driver isn't in the car is lawfully parked, there's nothing wrong with the car being there, and yet maybe because they were frustrated that they couldn't find anything wrong in the house, other than just finding the suspect, they just kind of fall back onto what they know, which is towing the car and doing an inventory search.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And I think what's going on here is that, to be perfectly honest, there's no better or easier way to say this, like, the police screwed up. The police knew that red Altima was involved in their suspected drug dealing. They could have easily gotten a warrant to search that Altima. Hell, they took the car to go sell drugs.
Yeah, they could have got a warrant in probably an hour or two and then just come on back, and they had the keys.
They had the keys. They could have simply secured the car and gotten a warrant, and they could have relied not on this magical bag of dope, but just on the fact that they knew this car was involved in the drug dealing that they were investigating, because they bought drugs from somebody who drove the car. Like, that pretty clearly ties it to the drug dealing. So this really was the government sort of messing up, for lack of a better word, and trying to use a shortcut to get into the car anyway. And you see the district court went along with it, said it was perfectly fine. And that's the importance of having engaged judges that actually will closely evaluate the evidence, because if you're just going to use if you're just going to credulously go along with whatever the police believe, no matter what, then your Fourth Amendment rights really don't mean much of anything. So it's important to have judges who are really willing to put the government to its burden and say, does the evidence actually support what the government did here?
Now, Rob, I should add, is the leader of our project on the Fourth Amendment. And so he has various cases going in Fourth Amendment search and seizure land. And so his expertise, we appreciate, has been lent to this particular Fourth Amendment situation. But before we move on, Rob, what are a couple Fourth Amendment cases that our listeners should keep in mind and maybe keep their eyes on that IJ's up to?
Well, I'd say we have an incredible amount going on, especially in one of the major areas is our open fields litigation. That's where the police can march onto your private property without a warrant, without any probable cause. And, the federal government has said, or the U.S. Supreme Court said that's okay, but a lot of states are pushing back. And so we have cases in Pennsylvania and Tennessee. We have cases challenging the seizure of over $100 million in cash and jewelry from a vault in California. Unfortunately, our plate is very full because the government is consistently infringing on our search and seizure rights. And
it is a target-rich environment.
Indeed.
Well, another target often are peaceful protesters, although sometimes they engage in unlawful assembly, whatever that means. So Suranjan is here to help explain what it means and what was going on in the city of Florissant, I think how you say that, Missouri.
Sure. Thanks, Anthony. I think it's Florissant, but my apologies to the denizens of that area for if it's Florissant, Coruscant, I don't know. That was a Star Wars joke. Okay.
There's a lot of unlawful assemblies in Coruscant, but that's a different story.
So I think we can all recall it's still fresh on the minds of the whole country and the world. Summer of 2020. The death of George Floyd during an arrest by the Minneapolis police, and how that sparked a series of protests around the country and eventually around the world against police brutality associated in one shape or another with the groups of Black Lives Matter, et cetera. Well, shortly after that, there was a police officer in Florissant, Missouri, who hit a suspect with his car. And he said that he tried to avoid hitting the suspect, et cetera. But then when video came out, it suggested that actually maybe he didn't actually try to avoid hitting the suspect. Maybe he actually tried to hit the suspect. And that sparked a lot of more protests in Florissant, Missouri itself, right in and around the police station. And so this case involves in a couple of weeks during that June and July when allegedly the Florissant police had declared unlawful assembly and ordered the crowd that was around the police station to disperse, either to move to the other side of the street or move out of the street and that they were arrested people, including one of the plaintiffs for unlawful assembly. And what the plaintiffs in this case were alleging is that the Florissant police were doing that despite the elements of unlawful assembly not being met in Missouri. And so in Missouri, unlawful assembly has two main elements here. That one, it has to involve a certain requisite number of people, but more importantly for this case, it has to involve violence or plans for imminent violence. And so these plaintiffs were alleging that their city of Florissant has a policy and practice of declaring assemblies unlawful and ordering them to disperse for under threat of arrest, even if they are being peaceful, even if they're not being violent and they're not planning violence, and that this policy and practice chills the protesters' First Amendment rights. So they're afraid to come back and protest under suspicion that they will be arrested for unlawful assembly, notwithstanding that they're being peaceful. And also that it violates the due process notice requirements to subject people to this threat of arrest when the elements of the offense are not being met. So the district court dismissed their complaint for failure to state a claim under 12b-6, that in saying that the city's ability to declare assemblies unlawful or to order people to disperse isn't tethered to the Missouri statute that outlines what the offense of unlawful assembly is, that the city has other legitimate police power reasons for ordering crowds to disperse or for declaring that people are gathered unlawfully, namely traffic management, and that the obvious alternative explanation here is that the city is managing its traffic, that these people were standing in the sidewalk, standing in the street. And there are a few allegations in the complaint that the district court pointed to of saying that, well, the police ordered the protesters out of the street and across the street, or that the protesters were writing Black Lives Matter on the sidewalk. And so the district court took that as alleging that they were, in fact, obstructing traffic. And so that district court opinion was affirmed on appeal by a divided panel, which with the dissent suggesting it was Judge Kelly from this is all, of course, the Eighth Circuit, saying that the lower court had impermissibly made inferences in favor of the city here. That it might be that the protesters here were blocking traffic, were impinging the access to the sidewalk or whatever, but to find that is the obvious alternative explanation here at the motion to dismiss level is an improper interference against the plaintiffs. So I don't mean to break your guys' heart, but I think that a dismissal was the right decision here. I'm not sure for quite exactly the reasons that the court says. So the way I approach complaint writing is that if I can prove my factual allegations, I should win. I know it's not exactly what Twickball says, but that's the way I approach it.
Right, and Twickball. Sorry to jump in. Twickball being Twombly and Iqbal, these kind of the Supreme Court's statements on how you write complaints of that have controlled kind of the complaint writing law for the last few years.
Right, and so basically, the way I like to look at it is that if you can read this complaint and step back and say, okay, so then there's a problem. And the problem here is that the basis for the allegation, the basis for this wrongful practice was that the city has a practice, allegedly, of declaring assemblies unlawful and ordering people to disperse under threat of arrest, absent the elements of Missouri's unlawful assembly criminal statute, right? But the problem here, as I see it, is that even if you prove that the city is doing that wouldn't get you a victory, because the city can say, and basically did say, that's right. We have a policy and practice of declaring assemblies unlawful in the absence of force or violence. That policy and practice is spelled out in ordinance. It's this ordinance saying that we can manage traffic. And here I think now, maybe this is a little bit of a closer call, but I think the court is viewing it as a bit of an equivocation between declaring an unlawful assembly and declaring that people are assembled unlawfully, it's because so look at it this way. The plaintiffs asked the court for injunction ordering the city not to declare assemblies unlawful or order that people disperse in the absence of force or violence. Okay? Let's say that the court did that and issued that injunction. That injunction would prevent the city from enforcing its ordinance prohibiting people from blocking traffic on the roads or in the sidewalks. And at oral argument, the ACLU's attorney, or this is the ACLU case, the plaintiff's attorney eventually more or less conceded that their theory depended on the notion that you cannot order a crowd of protesters to disperse or move based on the notion that some of them are impeding traffic. And just the last thing I'll say here before is that I think what really hurt the plaintiffs in this case is that their original complaint included a facial claim challenging the city's traffic impediment ordinance. And the initial complaint asserted that ordinance burdened speech without being sufficiently tailored to keeping sidewalks and streets open, in part because it would apply not only when someone is hindering traffic, but when someone is committing an act that tends to hinder traffic. And they then amended their complaint to get rid of all of these claims pointing to a city ordinance, and rested instead their entire lawsuit the notion that the city's ordering protesters to move despite Missouri criminal statutes not being triggered. And I think it had to have been on the district court's mind that, well, yeah, the city has a policy of doing that. That policy is written out in its ordinance, the ordinance that you guys are no longer challenging. And so as I said, that's not to say that there wasn't some sort of claim here. I feel like the complaint here was alleged in a way that did allow the court to say, even if you prove everything that you're saying, that doesn't warrant the relief you're seeking.
Rob, how are you with unlawful assemblies? Is this one you'd engage in or sue about?
I probably wouldn't do it this way. I do think that there's probably a claim here somewhere, but it sounds like they just pleaded it as poorly as they probably could have. I mean, it sounds like what they're really saying here is that what the government was doing, despite all these policies in place, what they're really doing is declaring an unlawful assembly because they didn't like the subject matter of what they were protesting about. Now, I understand that requires some to be able to get into the mind of the people who declared the unlawful assembly, but that seems to be much more akin to what is actually going on here. And if they had now, do you think, Suranjan, since you've looked at this, do you think could they have written a narrower complaint that just targeted what I'm saying, that this was really just a pretext, this was really meant to suppress our content, our message? And if so, why do you think they didn't do that?
From my reading of the complaint, I don't read there to be a single allegation saying that they're selectively enforcing it based on the content of the speech. I think that, you might be able to really stretch it, read between the lines and think to yourself, oh, maybe that this is what's going on. But that's not at all what they're saying is deficient about the city's policy or practice here. What they're saying is the city has a policy or practice of declaring assemblies unlawful and ordering people to disperse, even though the assembly is not being violent. Okay,
but there's lots of, as you pointed out, lots of perfectly valid police power reasons to declare an assembly unlawful, even if it weren't necessarily going violent.
Although on the other side of this, right? So this is what the plaintiff's attorneys would probably say is maybe we could have written a better complaint, and we can talk a little bit more about what's wrong with the complaint, but that you should read it in the light most favorable to the plaintiff, right? That's what motion to dismiss is all about. And in alleging that, they're alleging the whole universe of, why this might be this policy might be enforced when there isn't violence. And of course, there's a huge part of that policy that could be to suppress legitimate First Amendment activity, not because there's danger in traffic and sidewalk obstruction. And so reading that, I think that's where Judge Kelly seems to be coming from, is reading it in the light most favorable to the plaintiffs. Come on. It looks like there could be a constitutional violation there. It could be that these people were always in the street blocking traffic. It was terrible. So every time they enforced it, it was okay. And so their policy overall is constitutional, even if you want to have a facial, if I can use that term, look at this unwritten policy. But that's what's really going on here. And so it's a little bit, in my mind, it's a little bit more of a hard edge use of the motion to dismiss standard, the Twombly-Iqbal standard that you mentioned, Suranjan, then typically you find, and maybe this is just because I'm jaded from many years where I had to argue such things about much more detailed complaints, but I can see where the plaintiffs are coming from there.
I certainly agree with that. I see where the plaintiffs are coming from. And so I don't want it at all to be read as suggesting that the city of Florissant is decidedly not violating anyone's constitutional rights. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But I mean, this is, I guess, always the name of the game, right? Is to where's the line where you're making all reasonable inferences in favor of the plaintiff versus you're reading a complaint that wasn't actually alleged. And so I the way I read it, a lot of the red flags that stuck out to me throughout this complaint is that they never once alleged that they aren't breaking the law. They just allege that they're not being violent. And they keep saying that these are peaceful protests. These are nonviolent protests. We are protesting nonviolently. And so I think that the way the dissent reads it, and I think that the whole obvious factual, it's not that they're alleging facts that if you prove this, you'll win. But we, the court, thinks that there's obvious alternative factual situations here that probably are correct, and so we're going to go ahead and dismiss it. I think it's that they're alleging facts where even if you prove it, it says, yes, the city has a policy of doing this. It's in our ordinance, the one that you're not challenging anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, and as I said, I listened to the oral argument for this, and the lawyer that was representing the ACLU's position here was pretty much had to acknowledge that their case rose and fall on is it legitimate for the government to disperse a crowd for reasons other than that they're being violent, and it's just, I mean, that's pretty well settled that they can tell you to move for reasons when you're not. I mean,
Right.
I live in the DC area. If you were able to just block traffic and stuff and just say I'm not being violent and so therefore you can't move me, this city would grind to a halt, which maybe would please some people.
Isn't it basically ground to a halt because of the metro anyway? But anyway, that's a different story. One thing to step back a little bit and to have a little bit also of speculation. I think a lot of what's going on here, and probably is why that the complaint was amended, is because of the Monell standard that we have talked about in Short Circuit at times in the past, and we definitely talked about in the second season of Bound by Oath, which you guys can go check out, and we'll put a link in the show notes too. So that's the standard where you sue a city, not an individual officer, for violations of the Constitution, and it's weird how Monell works that we don't need to get into right now, but how they're alleging, it's peaceful protesting without getting too into the traffic stuff. I think probably that's how they felt they had to allege a Monell standard. Whereas if they were suing individual officers, and maybe they just didn't know how, they didn't think they could get an injunction if they sued individual officers, and they weren't going to sue for much damages. So that's maybe why they crafted the complaint this way. If they sued individual officers, then they could have said, yeah, this one time you shut down this assembly, everyone was peaceful on the sidewalk, there was no obstruction, and you shut them down because you don't like Black Lives Matter. Like, that's a good case, right? But if you're suing about Monell, it can't just be one time. It has to be this kind of general policy they have. And, I would not be surprised at all if there was a policy that summer to shut down all the Black Lives Matter protests, whatever they're doing. But because of Monell, they have to, kind of craft it this way, and maybe they guessed one way and they should have gone the other way. Who knows? But that's kind of my my supposition for what might be going on here.
I think that sounds right, Anthony. I think that they didn't sue any individual police officers. They sued only the city, and I think you're absolutely right that the key, I think, to understanding why, in my opinion, that the dismissal here was correct is looking at precisely what the Monell policy or practice was that they're alleging was unlawful or was unconstitutional. Yep. And as I said, the unlawful policy or practice here that they allege is that they're saying that people are unlawfully assembled and they're ordering them to disperse under threat of arrest, even though these Missouri criminal statutes haven't been triggered. And so it's just, that's, to me, isn't enough.
Yeah, a federal court, especially a federal appellate court that has jurisdiction over multiple states, is just simply not going to say that the police power, a city's police power, is completely circumscribed by state statute. In the sense, like, unless you're violating a state statute, you're automatically acting unconstitutionally. And that just does not seem something like a federal court's going to do, especially the Eighth Circuit.
Yes, we will have more to say on the Eighth Circuit in future weeks, but I think we'll leave it there for now. It's my home circuit, speaking here from Minnesota. Well, I would like to thank very much our guests for assembling in a very lawful way with me today and expressing their First Amendment rights. I'd like to thank all of you for exercising your First Amendment rights and listening to Short Circuit. We'll see you again in future weeks and maybe see some of you on March 31st, as I said, when we're talking about Meyer versus Nebraska. But in the meantime, I hope that all of you get engaged.